Chapter 1. The discovery. The map arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, wrapped in oiled canvas and smelling of age and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and unsettling. Like earth from a freshly dug grave, I found it. On the doorstep of my shop, Meridian Cartography, with no return address, no postmark, and no explanation for how it had gotten there. My name is David Ashford, and I've been restoring antique maps for 23 years. My shop, tucked away in a narrow alley in Boston's historic North End, has become something of a destination for collectors, historians, and the occasional treasure hunter looking for authentic period cartography. I've handled maps drawn by the great explorers, military surveys from forgotten wars, and nautical charts that guided ships across uncharted seas. But I'd never seen anything quite like the document that arrived that autumn morning. The map itself was extraordinary, hand-drawn on what appeared to be genuine vellum, with an artistry that suggested both medieval craftsmanship and impossible geographical knowledge. It depicted a section of coastal New England that I recognized immediately as the area around Salem, Massachusetts, but with details that shouldn't have existed when the map was created. The cartographer had signed it E. Whitmore, Anno Domini 1672, placing its creation during the early colonial period. But the map showed locations that wouldn't be established for decades, roads that weren't built until the 18th century, buildings that post-dated the signature by 50 years, and most mysteriously, a detailed layout of what appeared to be gallows, hill complete with annotations in Latin that made my skin crawl. Locus Malefici, Red 1 notation, the place of evil deeds. Another, positioned over what looked like a series of small structures. Read Carcer Animarum, Damnitarum, prison of the damned souls. I spent the morning examining the map with every tool at my disposal. The vellum appeared genuinely aged, with the kind of subtle discoloration and fiber breakdown that modern forgeries rarely achieve. The ink showed the characteristic bleeding and oxidation, patterns of authentic iron gall formulations used in the 17th century. Yet the geographical accuracy was impossible for the stated time period by lunch. I dephotographed every inch of the document and begun preliminary research into its provenance. The name E. Whitmore appeared in several historical records from colonial Massachusetts, but the references were fragmentary and often contradictory. Some sources described Ephraim Whitmore as a surveyor and mapmaker who had worked for the colonial government. Others suggested he was a scholar of natural philosophy, what we would now call a scientist. A few darker references hinted at accusations of witchcraft and a mysterious disappearance in 1692. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of the map's strange properties. The parchment seemed to retain heat longer than it should have, remaining warm to the touch even when I'd moved it away from the desk lamp. The ink appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, as if the lines were subtly repositioning themselves. Most unsettling of all, I began to notice details that I could have sworn weren't there when I'd first unwrapped the document. New annotations appeared over the course of the day, not physically manifesting, but simply becoming visible, as if they had always been present and I had somehow overlooked them. By evening, the map contained nearly twice as many Latin inscriptions as I had originally documented, each one more ominous than the last. Hic sunt queen nan mortui sunt. Here are those who are not dead. Sanguis innocentium clamarci. Iteha. The blood of innocence cries out from the earth. Custodit quae custodita. The guardian is guarded. I stayed late that night, unable to pull myself away from the mysterious document. There was something compelling about it, an almost magnetic quality that made it difficult to focus on anything else. I found myself tracing the cartographic lines with my finger, following roads that led to structures marked with symbols I didn't recognize. It was nearly midnight when I noticed the map was glowing, not brightly, just a faint phosphorescence that was barely visible in the darkened shop. The glow seemed concentrated around certain areas: Gallows Hill, a section of forest marked Silver Perdita, the Lost Woods, and a structure near the coast labeled Therese, Vigilancia, the Watchtower. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on my vision, but the glow remained. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger. That's when I heard the whispers. They started so quietly that I thought they might be coming from outside. Late-night conversations from passers-by in the alley. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sounds were coming from the map itself. Soft voices speaking in a language that sounded like English, but with archaic pronunciation and unfamiliar vocabulary. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words ... The binding weakens with each passing year ... double quotes ... He promised us rest, but gave us only endless watching ... The map remembers what we have forgotten ... The voices were overlapping, creating a whispered chorus of complaints and lamentations. I grabbed my digital recorder and held it near the map, desperate to capture evidence of what I was experiencing. As soon as the recording device approached the parchment, the whispers stopped abruptly, as if the speakers had suddenly become aware of my presence. The glow faded to almost nothing, and for a moment the map looked like nothing more than an unusual but conventional antique document. Then, in the sudden silence, a single voice spoke clearly and directly to me. David Ashford. I nearly dropped the recorder. The voice knew my name. You have been chosen to complete the work that Ephraim Whitmore began 3 centuries ago. The time of binding is nearly ended, and the guardians grow weary. Will you take up the burden of the cartographer's curse? Who are you? I whispered, feeling foolish for speaking to a piece of parchment, but unable to stop myself. We are the Watchers, the voice replied, bound to this map by oath and obligation, tasked with maintaining the barriers between worlds. But our vigil is ending, and new guardians must be chosen. The glow returned to the map, brighter now, and I could see that the layout was changing. Before my eyes, roads were extending themselves, new structures appearing, and the annotations were shifting and multiplying. The document was transforming into something more comprehensive, more detailed, a complete survey of hidden Salem that existed alongside but separate from the ordinary world. What do you want from me? I asked. Come to Salem, the voice said. Follow the map to the places marked with the seal of Ephraim. Learn the truth about what was bound here, and decide whether you will help us maintain the barriers or allow them to fail. What happens if the barriers fail? But the voice didn't answer. The glow faded, the whispers ceased, and the map returned to its previous state. I was left alone in my darkened shop with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that my life had just taken a turn toward the impossible. I spent the rest of the night researching Ephraim Whitmore and colonial Salem, diving deep into historical archives and genealogical records. What I found painted a picture of a brilliant but troubled man who had become obsessed with what he called the spaces between spaces, areas where the physical world grew thin and other realities bled through. Whitmore's surviving writings, preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, described his belief that certain geographical locations served as natural crossing points between dimensions. He theorized that the intense emotional energy generated by traumatic events could weaken the barriers between worlds, creating permanent doorways that needed to be monitored and maintained. According to his notes, Salem had become such a location. During the witch trials of 1692, the combination of mass hysteria, judicial murder, and collective guilt had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself. Whitmore claimed to have developed methods for mapping these dimensional weak points and binding them with what he called cartographic seals, symbols and patterns that could redirect otherworldly energies and prevent dangerous crossings. His final journal entry, dated just days before his disappearance, was particularly troubling. The seals hold, but barely. Each year brings new pressures from the other side, new attempts by those who would cross over to our world. I have trained others in the art of map binding, but they grow old as I do, and who will replace us when we are gone? The burden of the watchers is heavy, but the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Someone must continue the work, or Salem will become a gateway for entities that should never walk in the sunlight. As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, I made my decision. I carefully wrapped the map in acid-free tissue, packed it in a protective case, and loaded my car with everything I thought I might need for an extended research trip. By 9 a.m., I was driving north toward Salem, following Route 1A along the coast as autumn colors blazed in the morning sun. The drive took less than an hour, but it felt like a journey backward through time. The closer I got to Salem, the more the landscape seemed to match the mysterious map. Roads appeared exactly where Whitmore had drawn them, even when they seemed to lead nowhere obvious. Buildings sat in locations that corresponded perfectly to the map's annotations, often bearing architectural details that shouldn't have survived 3 centuries of development and modernization. I checked into a bed and breakfast on Chestnut Street, a Georgian colonial that had been built in 1785, according to the historical plaque by the front door. But as I compared the building to Whitmore's map, I realized it appeared there as well, labeled Hospitium via Terrace, the Traveller's Inn. The structure had been planned and positioned according to some larger design that predated its actual construction by more than a century. My room was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the harbor and the historic district. As I unpacked my equipment and spread the map across the antique writing desk, I noticed that the view from my window matched one of Whitmore's detailed sketches exactly. I was looking out at Salem from the precise vantage point the cartographer had chosen for his survey work. That afternoon, I began my investigation by visiting the locations marked on the map. I started with the Salem Witch Museum, built on the site of what Whitmore had labeled Locus Condemnationis, the place of condemnation. According to the map, this was where the accused witches had been formally sentenced, and it was marked with one of the most elaborate seals I had seen anywhere on the document. The museum was crowded with tourists, but as I walked through the exhibits, I began to notice things others seemed to miss. Cold spots that corresponded to specific locations on Whitmore's map. Audio equipment that occasionally picked up voices speaking in 17th century English. Display cases that sometimes reflected images that weren't actually in the room. I was studying a diorama of the witch trials when I felt someone watching me. I turned to find a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes, studying me with obvious interest. "You're the one with Ephraim's map," she said without preamble. I tried to look casual, but she smiled at my obvious surprise. Don't worry, Mr. Ashford. My name is Margaret Blackthorne. I'm what you might call a local expert on Salem's hidden history. Ephraim was my ancestor. My great-grandmother was his apprentice before he disappeared. Apprentice in the arts of cartographic binding. The knowledge has been passed down through my family for 3 centuries, though each generation has understood a little less than the one before. I've been waiting for someone to bring that map back to Salem. We need to talk. Margaret led me out of the museum and down Federal Street to a small coffee shop that looked like it had been there since colonial times. We took a corner table away from other customers, and she pulled out a leather portfolio filled with documents I recognized as being related to Whitmore's work. The map chose you, she said, spreading out photocopies of historical papers. That's how it works. Every few decades, when the bindings grow weak, the map finds its way to someone with the right combination of knowledge and sensitivity to otherworldly phenomena. You're not the first map maker it's contacted. There have been others, 5, over the past 3 centuries. Each one was tasked with renewing the seals, updating the cartographic bindings, and training new watchers to maintain the barriers. The last one was a man named Jonathan Pierce. Back in 1987, he disappeared after completing his work, just like all the others. Margaret showed me a newspaper clipping from the Salem Evening News, dated November 1987. The headline read, "Local Antiquarian Missing After Salem Research Project." The accompanying photo showed a man in his 40s standing next to a display of antique maps. Even in the grainy newsprint reproduction, I could see he was holding what appeared to be Whitmore's document. What happened to him? The same thing that happened to Ephraim and to all the others. Once the work is complete, once the new seals are in place and the barriers are renewed, the cartographer becomes part of the map itself. They join the watchers, bound to maintain the defenses until the next renewal is needed. I felt a chill run down my spine. You're saying I'm going to disappear. I'm saying you have a choice. The map can't force you to complete the work. It can only show you what needs to be done and hope you'll choose to do it. But if you refuse, if the barriers continue to weaken without intervention, the consequences for Salem and the surrounding area could be catastrophic. Margaret pulled out another documenter, hand-drawn sketch of what appeared to be creatures emerging from cracks in the earth. The drawing was crude but disturbing, showing beings that seemed to be composed of shadow and malevolence, with too many limbs and faces that hurt to look at directly. These are some of the entities that have been trying to cross over from what Ephraim called the other side, she explained. They're drawn to places where traumatic events have weakened reality's fabric. Salem's history of persecution and murder makes it a particularly attractive target, and the map shows where they might break through. The map shows everything, where the barriers are strong, where they're weak, where they've been reinforced, and where they're in danger of failing. It's a complete survey of Salem's supernatural geography, updated in real time by the consciousness of the watchers. I thought about the voices I'd heard in my shop, the way the map had seemed to respond to my presence. The watchers, they're the previous cartographers, among others. Ephraim recruited volunteers from the local community, people who were willing to sacrifice their normal lives to help maintain the barriers. They exist in a state between life and death, conscious and aware, but no longer fully part of the physical world. Margaret gathered up her papers and stood to leave. I've given you the background you need to understand what you're dealing with. The rest is up to you. If you decide to proceed, follow the map to the first seal location, the place marked Initium Laboris. That's where Ephraim began his work, and where you'll need to begin yours. Wait, I called, as she headed for the door. How will I know what to do? She turned back with a sad smile. The map will teach you, just as it taught all the others, but remember, Mr. Ashford, knowledge comes with a price, and some lessons can't be unlearned. Chapter 2. The First Sea Laughter. Margaret left. I returned to my room and studied the map more carefully, looking for the location she had mentioned. Initium Laboris was marked in a section of forest about 3 miles southeast of downtown Salem, in an area that modern maps showed as Shabako Woods. According to Whitmore's annotations, this was where he had first detected the dimensional weaknesses that would later require mapping and binding. The seal symbol at this location was relatively simple compared to others on the map, a circle containing a pentagram with Latin text arranged around the perimeter. But as I examined it more closely, I realized the symbol was moving. The lines of the pentagram slowly rotated within the circle, while the Latin text shifted and changed, displaying different phrases in sequence. Custos, Primus, the first guardian, Ion Clausa, te closed door, pax inter mundos, peace between worlds. I decided to visit the location immediately. The afternoon sun was already low on the horizon, and I wanted to reach the woods before dark. I loaded my car with the equipment I thought I might need: cameras, recording devices, a GPS unit, and a backpack full of supplies, and drove out of town following the route indicated on Whitmore's map. The roads were exactly where the cartographer had placed them, though some were now paved highways that hadn't existed in 1672. I found myself taking a series of increasingly narrow roads, until I was driving on what was little more than a dirt track through dense forest. According to my GPS, I was in the middle of nowhere, at least 5 miles from the nearest marked trail. But Whitmore's map showed I was approaching the first seal location. I parked the car and continued on foot, using the historical document as my primary guide. The forest was older than it should have been. I'm no expert on New England ecology, but some of the trees I passed looked like they had been growing for centuries, longer than the 350 years since European settlement. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their massive trunks scarred by lightning and age, while underneath, the forest floor was carpeted with ferns that seemed almost prehistoric in their size and variety. As I hiked deeper into the woods, following the path indicated on Whitmore's map, I began to notice other anomalies. The temperature was dropping, even though the afternoon sun was still visible through the canopy. The normal forest sounds, birds, insects, small animals, had faded too. An unnatural silence, and there was a quality to the light that made everything seem slightly unreal, as if I were walking through a photograph rather than an actual landscape. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I reached a clearing that matched the location marked on the map. It was roughly circular, perhaps 50 feet across, surrounded by trees that formed an almost perfect ring. In the center of the clearing stood a single stone monumenta granite pillar about 6 feet tall, covered with carved symbols that I recognized as matching the seal shown on Whitmore's document. But the pillar wasn't the most striking feature of the clearing. What caught my attention immediately were the shadows. They were wrong, despite the late afternoon sun streaming down from the west. The shadows in the clearing fell in multiple directions, as if lit by several different light sources. Some trees cast shadows toward the north, while others cast them toward the south. The stone pillar had 3 distinct shadows, each pointing in a different direction and varying in length and intensity. I approached the monument carefully, taking photographs as I went. The carved symbols were intricate and beautifully executed, clearly the work of a master craftsman. Most were variations on the seal design from the map, but others were completely unfamiliar geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't. Looking directly at them, and text in alphabets I couldn't identify as I circled the pillar, I noticed that the carvings weren't just decorative. They formed a complex narrative that told the story of Whitmore's work in Salem. One section showed a man with surveying equipment mapping an area plagued by strange phenomena. Another depicted the same man consulting with robed figures who might have been scholars or clergy. A third showed him working with others to construct what appeared to be a series of monuments or markers. But the most disturbing section showed the consequences of failure. If I was interpreting the symbolic narrative correctly, the carvings depicted creatures emerging from cracks in the earth, structures being consumed by unnatural fires, and people fleeing in terror from entities that defied description. I was so absorbed in documenting the pillar that I almost missed the moment when the forest around me began to change. It started with the shadows, which slowly began to align themselves, all pointing toward the monument regardless of the sun's position. Then the temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The unnatural silence deepened until I couldn't even hear my own footsteps on the forest floor. That's when I noticed I was no longer alone in the clearing. Translucent figures had appeared among the trees, men and women in colonial period clothing, standing motionless as if waiting for something. They were clearly not entirely present in the physical world, appearing more like projections or holograms than solid beings. But their eyes followed my movement with obvious intelligence and awareness. Counted at least a dozen figures, though more seemed to be materializing as I watched. Some were dressed as ordinary colonists, farmers, craftsmen, housewives. Others wore the black robes of clergy or the more elaborate clothing of merchants and officials. All of them looked sad, weary, as if they had been waiting for a very long time. One figure stood apart from the others, positioned directly opposite me across the clearing. Even in his translucent state, I recognized him from historical portraits I'd found during my research. Ephraim Whitmore himself, looking exactly as he had in life, but bearing the unmistakable weight of centuries. He stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself was speaking. "You have answered the call, David Ashford. The first seal awaits renewal." "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I admitted. "The knowledge will come when you need it. Touch the stone and open yourself to the wisdom of those who came before." I hesitated, remembering Margaret's warnings about the price of knowledge and the fate of previous cartographers. But the barriers to fail and unleashing whatever horrors waited on the other side seemed far worse than any personal cost I might have to pay. I placed my palm against the carved surface of the monument. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Knowledge flooded into my mind, not just information, but complete understanding of concepts I'd never encountered before. I suddenly comprehended the true nature of dimensional barriers, the mathematics of otherworldly geometry, and the principles behind cartographic binding. I understood that reality was not solid and unchanging, but fluid and malleable, held in its current form by the collective belief and attention of conscious beings. In places where traumatic events had occurred, where large numbers of people had experienced intense fear, pain, or despair, that collective psychic energy could actually damage the structure of reality itself, creating weak points where other dimensions might bleed through. The Salem witch trials had been precisely such an event. 20 people had died, hundreds more had been imprisoned and tortured, and an entire community had been consumed by paranoid hysteria. The cumulative psychic trauma had torn holes in the fabric of space-time, creating doorways between our world and realms that should have remained forever separate. Ephraim Whitmore had discovered these dimensional weak points during his surveying work, initially mistaking them for natural phenomena. But as he'd studied them more carefully, he'd realized they were growing larger and more unstable with each passing year. Entities from the other side were beginning to take notice, testing the barriers and probing for ways to cross over into our reality. Whitmore had developed the science of cartographic binding as a way to reinforce the damaged barriers, by creating detailed maps of the affected areas and embedding them with specific symbols and mathematical formulas. He could redirect the flow of dimensional energy and strengthen the boundaries between worlds. The maps became more than mere representations of geography. They became active tools for maintaining the stability of reality itself. But the binding process required conscious guardians, people willing to merge their awareness with the maps and spend their existence monitoring the barriers for signs of weakness or intrusion. The Watchers were not dead, exactly, but they were no longer fully alive in any conventional sense. They existed in a liminal state, partly in our world and partly in the dimensional spaces between worlds, eternally vigilant against threats that ordinary humans could never perceive. As this knowledge settled into my mind, I began to understand what I was seeing in the clearing. The translucent figures were the current generation of Watchers, the people who had volunteered over the past 3 centuries to help maintain Salem's dimensional integrity. They were led by Ephraim himself, who had taken on the role of primary coordinator when his original body had finally been abandoned, sometime in the early 18th century. But the system was breaking down. The seals that bound the maps to the physical locations were degrading over time, weakened by natural erosion, human interference, and the constant pressure from entities trying to break through from the other side. Each generation of Watchers grew more tired, more detached from their protective duties. Soon, the barriers would fail entirely unless new seals were created and new guardians were recruited. "Now, you understand," Ephraim said as the knowledge transfer completed. "The question is whether you will accept the responsibility that comes with understanding." What exactly would I have to do? Travel to each of the 13 seal locations, marked on the map, renew the cartographic bindings using the methods I will teach you, recruit new Watchers from among those called to the work, and when your task is complete, I become a Watcher myself. The choice is yours, David. But consider this: if the barriers fail, Salem will become a crossing point for entities that view human suffering as entertainment and human flesh as sustenance. The witch trials will seem like a minor historical footnote compared to what will follow. I looked around the clearing at the assembled Watchers, seeing in their faces the weight of centuries of sacrifice and service. They had given up their normal human lives to protect people who would never know they existed, maintaining a vigil against horrors that most people couldn't even imagine. But I also thought about Margaret's description of the creatures that waited on the other side, and about the newspaper accounts of people who had simply vanished after taking on the cartographer's role. Was I really prepared to sacrifice everything for a responsibility I had never sought? Before I could answer, one of the Watchers stepped forward, a woman in her 30s, wearing the simple dress of a colonial housewife. When she spoke, her voice carried the accent and inflection of 17th century New England. I was Sarah Holbrook. In life, good wife to Thomas, and mother to 3 children. I died of fever in the winter of 1693, but chose to remain as a watcher rather than pass on to whatever comes after death. For more than 3 centuries, I have helped guard this place against entities that would devour the souls of the living. She gestured toward other figures in the clearing, and one by one, they began to speak. I was Jonathan Prescott, merchant and father of 5. I volunteered to join the Watchers in 1734, after seeing what crossed over during a temporary seal failure. I have no regrets. I was Mary Corey, accused witch, who was fortunate enough to escape hanging. I became a Watcher in 1701, dedicating my continued existence to protecting others from the true evils that the trials failed to recognize. I was David Hartwell, the cartographer who renewed the seals in 1823. I chose to remain as primary guardian rather than return to mortal life. Each Watcher shared a similar story, people who had given up their chance at normal death and whatever lay beyond in order to protect the living from supernatural threats. Some had volunteered during their lifetimes, accepting the role as a sacred duty. Others had been recruited after death, choosing service over rest when they learned of the dangers facing their community. All of them had made the same choice I was now being asked to make. I need time to think about this, I said, finally. Ephraim nodded. You have until the new moon, 6 days from now. That is when the barriers will be weakest and the need for renewal most urgent. Use that time to visit the other seal locations, to understand the full scope of what you would be undertaking. But know that delay carries its own risks each day. The seals remain unrenewed, brings us closer to catastrophic failure. The figures began to fade as the sun set behind the trees, returning to whatever dimensional space they normally inhabited. But before Ephraim disappeared completely, he had one final message. The map will guide you to the next location when you are ready. But beware, we are not the only ones who know the renewal time approaches. Others are aware of your presence. In Salem, entities that would prefer to see the barriers fail. Trust your instincts, and remember that not everyone who offers help has your best interests at heart. Chapter 3. The Opposition. I made it back to my car just as full darkness settled over the forest. But the drive to town took much longer than the outward journey. The dirt roads seemed to shift and change when I wasn't paying attention, leading me in circles through sections of woodland that didn't match my memory of the afternoon hike. It was nearly midnight by the time I finally found my way back to Route 114 and the familiar landmarks of Salem proper. My room at the bed and breakfast felt like a sanctuary after the otherworldly experience in the forest. I spread Whitmore's map across the writing desk and studied it by lamplight, noting how the first seal location now showed different symbols than it had before. The rotating pentagram had stopped moving and now displayed a new configuration, while additional Latin text had appeared around the margins: Primus Custos Acceptus. The first guardian accepted Tempus, Renovationis, Initium, the time of renewal begins. Quinqua dies. Restant 5 days remain. The map was tracking my progress and counting down to some kind of deadline. I realized that the new moon Ephraim had mentioned wasn't just a convenient time frame. It was when the dimensional barriers would be at their weakest, making it the optimal time for renewal, but also the most dangerous period if the work wasn't completed. I was studying the location of the second seal when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. That wasn't unusual in itself. The bed and breakfast had other guests, and people occasionally moved around at night. But these footsteps stopped directly outside my door and remained there, as if someone was listening. I quietly approached the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway appeared empty, but the footsteps resumed, pacing back and forth in front of my room. I could hear them clearly, the distinctive sound of leather shoes on hardwood floors, but I couldn't see anyone making them. After several minutes, the pacing stopped. I waited, listening carefully, but heard nothing more. I was about to return to my work when I noticed something had been slipped under my door. It was an envelope made of expensive paper, with my name written on the front in elegant calligraphy. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, containing a brief message. Mr. Ashford, your presence in Salem has been noted by those who take a keen interest in the town's unique history. We would very much like to meet with you to discuss matters of mutual concern. If you are willing, please join us tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. at the address written below. We believe you will find our conversation enlightening. The Obsidian Circle. The address was for a location on Federal Street, not far from the Witch Museum. I'd never heard of the Obsidian Circle, but the formal tone of the invitation and the expensive stationery suggested people with significant resources and social connections. Spent the rest of the night researching the organization online, but found very little information. There were a few references to the Obsidian Circle in academic papers about Salem's occult history, describing it as a private society dedicated to the study of paranormal phenomena. But the details were vague and contradictory. One source claimed it had been founded in the late 19th century by wealthy spiritualists. Another suggested it was a more recent organization that had adopted the name and symbols of an older group. What I did find was several news articles from the past 30 years about prominent Salem residents who had died under mysterious circumstances. The deaths were always ruled accidental or natural, but the pattern was troubling. Each person had been involved in historical research related to the witch trials, and several had been known to collect antique maps and documents from the colonial period. Most significantly, one of the deceased researchers was Jonathan Pierce, the cartographer who had disappeared in 1987 after apparently completing Whitmore's seal renewal process. According to the newspaper coverage, Pierce's body had been found in his home 3 days after he was reported missing, with no obvious cause of death and no signs of violence or distress. I slept poorly that night, waking frequently to the sound of footsteps in the hallway and what seemed like whispered conversations just outside my hearing. Each time I checked the peephole, the corridor was empty, but the sounds continued until dawn. The next morning brought grey skies and a cold rain that seemed to leach the color out of everything. I decided to spend the day visiting some of the other locations marked on Whitmore's map, hoping to better understand the scope of the task I was being asked to undertake. The second seal was located in downtown Salem, in what appeared to be the basement of a building that now housed a shop selling tourist souvenirs and alleged magical supplies. According to the map, this site was labeled Locus Interrogationis, the place of questioning, and was marked with a more complex seal design that included multiple overlapping geometric patterns. I browsed the shop for a while, studying the layout and trying to determine how to access the basement level. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 40s with an elaborate collection of silver jewelry, watched me with obvious suspicion, looking for anything in particular. She asked when I'd spent nearly an hour examining items without making a purchase. Actually, I'm a historian doing research on colonial Salem. I'm particularly interested in buildings that date back to the late 17th century. This location appears in some historical documents I'm working with. Her expression shifted from suspicion to interest. You're the map guy, aren't you? The one staying at the Whitmore house. I was surprised she knew where I was staying, and even more surprised by her reference to my accommodation as the Whitmore house. The bed and breakfast had been called the Chestnut Street Inn when I'd checked in. I'm staying at the bed and breakfast on Chestnut Street, I said carefully. She smiled, but there was something unsettling about the expression. Oh, that's what they call it now for the tourists. But locals still remember the original name. That house was built by Ephraim Whitmore's great-nephew in 1785, using money inherited from the old mapmaker's estate. Funny how things circle back, isn't it? I realized I'd been guided to stay in a building with direct connections to Whitmore's family, whether that was coincidence or some form of supernatural influence. It suggested that my involvement in this situation was more predetermined than I'd originally thought. Would it be possible to see the basement level? I asked. I'm particularly interested in any original architectural features that might have survived from the colonial period. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I suppose that would be all right, but I should warn you the basement has some unusual characteristics. Temperature fluctuations, strange acoustics, that sort of thing. We mostly use it for storage now. She led me through a door marked Employees Only and down a narrow staircase that looked much older than the building's 19th century facade. The basement was larger than I'd expected, extending under what must have been several adjoining buildings. The walls were constructed of massive stone blocks that showed clear evidence of colonial-era craftsmanship, and the floor was made of brick laid in intricate geometric patterns. But what caught my attention immediately was the temperature. Despite the cold, rainy day above, the basement was uncomfortably warm, with a humidity that made the air feel thick and oppressive. There was also a faint sound, not quite music, not quite voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. This is where they held the preliminary hearings, the shopkeeper explained, noticing my interest in the stonework, before the accused were taken to the courthouse for formal trial. Local legend says you can still hear the voices of the interrogators and their victims on certain nights. I walked slowly around the basement, comparing its layout to the details shown on Whitmore's map. The correspondence was exact, down to the location of what appeared to be a sealed doorway in the eastern wall. According to the map, that doorway led to additional chambers that extended further underground, but the entrance had been bricked up sometime in the 18th century. Has anyone ever explored beyond that wall? I asked, pointing to the sealed entrance. The shopkeeper's expression grew troubled. There have been investigations over the years. People with ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists, curiosity seekers, but the results are always inconclusive. The equipment malfunctions, or the readings don't make sense, or... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable, or what? Or the investigators disappear. Not permanently, she added quickly. They always turn up eventually, but they're different somehow. Changed. Most of them leave Salem and never come back. I spent another hour examining the basement, taking photographs and comparing details to Whitmore's annotations. The seal location was clearly marked on the map, positioned directly above what the cartographer had labeled as Camera Secretorum, the secret chamber. According to his notes, this was where the most intensive interrogations had taken place, where psychological torture had been used to extract confessions from people who had committed no crimes beyond existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The psychic trauma generated by those sessions had created one of the most significant dimensional weak points in Salem. A place where the barrier between worlds was so thin that it required constant monitoring and regular reinforcement. As I prepared to leave, the shopkeeper handed me a business card. "If you're serious about researching Salem's hidden history, you should contact these people. They've been studying the town's unusual properties for decades." The card was for the Obsidian Circle, with the same address that had been mentioned in the previous night's mysterious invitation. "They contacted me yesterday," I said. "Do you know much about them?" Her expression became guarded. "They're influential people, wealthy, well-connected, very serious about their research. But they have their own agenda, if you know what I mean. Not everyone who gets involved with them finds the experience entirely positive. What kind of agenda? That's not for me to say. But if you do meet with them, be careful what you agree to. The Obsidian Circle has a way of making offers that seem too good to refuse, right up until you realize what you've actually signed up for." I left the shop with more questions than answers, but with a growing understanding of the complex supernatural landscape I was navigating. Salem wasn't just a town with a dark history, it was a place where that history continued to exert active influence on the present, where organizations like the Obsidian Circle competed with entities like the Watchers for control over forces that most people couldn't even imagine. The afternoon was spent visiting 3 more seal locations, each one revealing additional layers of the mystery. The 3rd seal was located in Gallows Hill Park, at the site where the condemned witches had actually been executed. The 4th was in the Old Burying Point, Salem's oldest cemetery, positioned directly above a mass grave that contained the remains of which trial victims who had died in prison. At each location, I found evidence of Whitmore's binding workstone markers carved with protective symbols, landscape features that had been deliberately positioned according to supernatural geometry, and subtle architectural elements that most visitors would dismiss as decorative, but which served important functions in maintaining dimensional stability. I also found evidence that the seals were indeed failing. Temperature anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, and sensory phenomena that suggested reality was becoming increasingly unstable in these areas. At Gallows Hill, I photographed what appeared to be cracks in the air, itself visible distortions in the atmosphere that resembled heat mirages but occurred in cool, humid conditions. By evening, I had a much clearer picture of what Ephraim Whitmore had accomplished and what I was being asked to continue. The 13 seal locations formed a protective network that surrounded and contained Salem's dimensional weak points, preventing entities from the other side from establishing permanent footholds in our reality. But the network was degrading, and without immediate renewal, it would fail entirely within days. As 7 p.m. approached, I found myself standing in front of a Georgian colonial mansion on Federal Street, checking the address against the invitation I'd received. The building was impressive, 3 stories of red brick with white trim, surrounded by a wrought iron fence and professionally maintained gardens. A discreet brass plaque by the front door identified it as the headquarters of the Obsidian Circle Historical Society. I was greeted at the door by a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes with significant wealth and social position. "Mr. Ashford, I presume." "I'm Dr. Charles Blackwood, president of the Obsidian Circle. Thank you for accepting our invitation." The name was familiar from my research. Blackwood had been one of Salem's prominent colonial families, with connections to the witch trials and to some of the town's most significant historical events. Dr. Blackwood bore a strong resemblance to portraits I'd seen of his ancestors, suggesting an unbroken family line. Stretching back to the 17th century, he led me through an elegantly appointed foyer into a library that could have belonged to a wealthy collector from the Victorian era. The walls were lined with bookcases containing what appeared to be an extraordinary collection of historical documents, rare books, and antique maps. Several display cases contained artifacts that I recognized as being related to the witch trials court documents, personal belongings of the accused, and items that had allegedly been used as evidence of supernatural activity. For other people were waiting in the library, all of them well-dressed and bearing the unmistakable confidence of the socially privileged. Dr. Blackwood made introductions. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, descendant of Judge John Hathorne, and our expert on colonial legal history, Mr. Robert Corey, whose ancestor Martha Corey was executed as a witch in 1692, Miss Elizabeth Nurse, great-great-granddaughter of Rebecca Nurse, another of the executed, and Professor William Bishop, our specialist in comparative occult studies. Each name carried historical weight. These were people whose families had been directly involved in the witch trials, either as accusers or victims. They represented continuity with Salem's traumatic past that went far beyond academic interest. "Please, have a seat," Dr. Blackwood said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned to face the others. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I suspect we share more common interests than you might initially suppose." I settled into the offered chair, noting how the arrangement positioned me as the focus of attention for the assembled group. It felt more like an interview or interrogation than a friendly meeting. "We know about the map," Dr. Hawthorne said without preamble. "We know about your encounter with the Watchers yesterday evening, and we know about your visits to the Seal. Locations today. What we don't know is whether you understand the true nature of what you're dealing with." "I'm beginning to get a sense of it," I replied carefully. "Dimensional barriers, otherworldly entities, protective seals that need periodic renewal. It's not exactly the kind of thing they cover in graduate school." Professor Bishop leaned forward, his expression intense. "The academic version is just the surface level, Mr. Ashford. The reality is far more complex and far more dangerous than Ephraim Whitmore ever imagined." "What do you mean?" "Whitmore was a brilliant man, but he was working with incomplete information," Dr. Blackwood explained. "He correctly identified the dimensional weak points and developed effective methods for reinforcing them, but he never understood what he was actually containing." Mr. Corey pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several historical documents. "These are records that the Obsidian Circle has been collecting for over a century, accounts of supernatural activity in Salem that predate the witch trials by decades, sometimes centuries. What Whitmore interpreted as damage caused by the trials was actually the result of something much older and more deliberate. The documents were fascinating but disturbing. Colonial records describing strange lights in the forest, disappearances of livestock and occasionally people, encounters with entities that didn't match any known wildlife, and reports of areas where the laws of physics seemed to operate differently. Salem wasn't chosen randomly as a site for settlement," Dr. Hawthorne continued. "The early colonists were guided here by individuals who knew about the area's unusual properties and wanted to exploit them. Exploit them how? By using the dimensional instability to make contact with entities from the other side," Professor Bishop said. "Not to defend against them, but to learn from them, to trade with them, to gain access to knowledge and power that wasn't available through normal means. Elizabeth Nurse spoke for the first time, her voice carrying an edge of ancient anger. My ancestor, Rebecca Nurse, wasn't executed for practicing witchcraft. She was killed because she discovered what was really happening in Salem and tried to stop it. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. If they were correct, the Salem witch trials hadn't been the result of mass hysteria and religious extremism. They had been a cover-up, a way of eliminating witnesses. Two activities that the colonial authorities wanted to keep secret. The people who were really practicing forbidden arts were never accused, Mr. Corey added bitterly. They were the ones making the accusations, using the trials to remove anyone who might expose their true activities. Dr. Blackwood stood and walked to one of the display cases, pulling out a leather-bound journal that looked contemporary with Whitmore's map. This is the diary of Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the men who presided over the witch trials. The public version of his writings expresses regret for his role in the executions, but his private journal tells a different story. He opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud, "The necessary work proceeds according to plan. The barriers between worlds grow thinner with each execution, and our contacts on the other side grow stronger. Soon we will have access to knowledge that will transform not just Salem, but all of New England. The sacrifice of a few innocent lives is a small price to pay for the advancement of human understanding." The historical revisionism was staggering. If the Obsidian Circle's research was accurate, the Salem witch trials had been a deliberate, supernatural experiment designed to weaken dimensional barriers and facilitate contact with otherworldly entities. The innocent people who died hadn't been victims of superstitious fear. They had been sacrificial offerings intended to power interdimensional communication. Whitmore discovered this truth sometime in the 1680s, Dr. Blackwood continued. He realized that Salem's dimensional instability wasn't accidental damage that needed to be repaired. It was an intentional creation that was still being actively maintained by the descendants of the original conspirators. So he created the seals to interfere with their work. Exactly. The binding network wasn't designed to protect Salem from otherworldly intrusion. It was designed to prevent the town's occult practitioners from continuing their experiments with contact. Professor Bishop pulled out another document, this one more recent. But Whitmore's interference was only partially successful. The seals disrupted the original network, but didn't eliminate it entirely. For 3 centuries, there have been 2 competing supernatural systems operating in Salem. Whitmore's protective barriers and the oldest summoning apparatus that predates colonial settlement. And now both systems are failing, Dr. Hawthorne added. The seals are degrading through natural entropy, while the summoning network is being actively restored by people who want to resume the original experiments. I felt a chill as I realized the implications. You're saying there are still people in Salem who want to weaken the dimensional barriers? Not just people in Salem, Elizabeth Nurse said grimly. Organizations around the world that study what they call practical occultism. They view Salem as a natural laboratory for testing theories about interdimensional contact and supernatural manipulation. Dr. Blackwood returned to his seat, his expression grave. The Watchers have done admirable work maintaining Whitmore's seals, but they're fighting a defensive battle against opponents who have greater resources and more sophisticated understanding of the forces involved. Each renewal cycle brings more pressure from the other side, and each generation of Watchers grows weaker and less capable of resistance. What are you suggesting? That the time has come to abandon Whitmore's defensive approach and adopt more aggressive methods, Professor Bishop said. Instead of simply maintaining barriers against otherworldly intrusion, we should take control of the dimensional weak points and use them for humanity's benefit. The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. They weren't just asking me to abandon the cartographer's traditional role. They wanted me to actively betray the Watchers and help them transform Salem into some kind of supernatural research facility. What exactly would that involve? Mr. Corey spread out a modern map of Salem, marked with locations that corresponded to Whitmore's seal sites, but with additional notations and symbols. We've spent decades developing an alternative binding system, one that doesn't just contain the dimensional weak points, but harnesses their energy for controlled experimentation. We can offer you resources that the Watchers never could, Dr. Hawthorne added. Funding for your research, access to historical documents that have never been made public, and the opportunity to work with some of the world's leading experts in supernatural phenomena. And if I refuse, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and I noticed that the shadows in the corners had grown darker and more substantial. Then you'll proceed with the traditional renewal process and likely suffer the same fate as your predecessors, Dr. Blackwood said quietly. Transformation into a Watcher, eternal servitude maintaining barriers that grow weaker with each passing year, and ultimate failure when the opposing forces finally overwhelm your defenses. Elizabeth Nurse leaned forward, her eyes reflecting an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. The old ways are dying. Mr. Ashford, the question is whether you want to be part of building something new, or whether you want to go down with a failing system. I looked around the room at the assembled members of the Obsidian Circle, realizing that I was facing a choice that would determine not just my own fate, but the future of Salem itself. On one side were the Watchers' tired guardians maintaining a defensive position against forces they didn't fully understand. On the other was an organization that claimed to offer greater knowledge and power, but at the cost of abandoning the protective principles that had kept Salem relatively safe for 3 centuries. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Dr. Blackwood replied smoothly. But remember that time is a luxury neither side can afford much longer. The new moon approaches, and decisions made in the next few days will have consequences that last for generations. As I prepared to leave, Professor Bishop handed me a leather satchel, some reading material to help inform your decision. Historical documents, research papers, and theoretical frameworks that might provide useful perspective on your situation. I accepted the satchel, noting how heavy it was and how warm it felt to the touch. Whatever it contained, it was more than simple paperwork. One final thought, Mr. Ashford, Dr. Blackwood said as he walked me to the door. The Watchers have told you that joining them is a choice, but they haven't been entirely honest about the alternatives. If you complete the seal renewal process, you will become bound to their network, whether you volunteer for the role or not. The cartographer's curse isn't just a quaint name, it's a literal, supernatural compulsion that traps anyone who performs the binding rituals. The implications of his statement followed me out into the night as I walked back toward my accommodation. If the Obsidian Circle was telling the truth, then the Watchers hadn't been offering me a choice at all. They had been maneuvering me into a position where I would have no option but to join their eternal vigil. But if the Obsidian Circle was lying, then I was being manipulated by people whose agenda involved deliberately weakening the barriers that protected Salem from otherworldly threats. Either way, I was caught between competing factions with vastly different visions for the town's supernatural future and my decision would determine which vision ultimately prevailed. Chapter 4. The hidden history I spent that night reading through the materials the Obsidian Circle had provided, and what I discovered challenged everything I thought I understood. About Salem's history and the nature of Whitmore's work, the leather satchel contained photocopies of documents from archives around the world, colonial records from Massachusetts, ecclesiastical reports from England, trading company correspondence from the Netherlands, and even accounts from Native American oral traditions that had been transcribed by 19th century ethnographies. Taken together, they painted a picture of Salem as a deliberately chosen site for supernatural experimentation that dated back centuries before European colonization. According to Abenaki tribal records, the area had been considered sacred but dangerous long before English settlers arrived. The tribal name for the region translated roughly as the place where the sky touches the earth, and it was traditionally avoided except by shamans who came to conduct specific rituals during certain astronomical alignments. The native accounts described phenomena that matched what I'd been observing areas where the laws of physics operated differently, creatures that didn't belong to the natural world, and doorways that opened onto landscapes that existed nowhere. On Earth, the Abenaki had developed elaborate protocols for managing these supernatural hazards, including seasonal ceremonies designed to reinforce what they called the boundaries between the day world and the night world. But European colonization had disrupted these traditional safeguards. The first English settlers, arriving in the 1620s, had been guided to the area by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of its unusual properties. Among the founding families were several members of what appeared to be an occult society that had originated in England during the early 17th century. This group, which called itself the Order of the Obsidian Mirror, had been collecting reports of supernatural phenomena throughout the known world and establishing settlements at locations where dimensional barriers were naturally weak. Their goal was to create a network of research stations where they could study otherworldly entities and develop methods for controlled interdimensional contact. Salem had been chosen as their primary North American facility because it combined natural dimensional instability with isolation from major population centers and governmental oversight. The founding charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony had included special provisions that granted unusual autonomy to Salem's governing council, ensuring that their experimental activities would be protected from outside interference. The witch trials of 1692 represented the climax of nearly 70 years of increasingly bold experimentation. By that time, the Order's activities had attracted the attention of otherworldly entities that viewed human suffering as a form of currency. The trials provided an ideal opportunity to generate massive amounts of psychic trauma in a controlled environment, opening doorways that allowed direct communication and trade with beings from parallel dimensions. But the experiments had also attracted unwanted attention from people like Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, and others who began to suspect that Salem's religious and civic leaders were involved in activities that had nothing to do with prosecuting actual witchcraft. The executions hadn't been the result of mass hysteria. They had been calculated eliminations of potential witnesses to interdimensional contact operations. Ephraim Whitmore had been among the few colonial officials who understood what was really happening. His original surveying work had been commissioned by the Order to document the effects of their experiments and identify optimal locations for future activities. But Whitmore had become horrified by what he witnessed and had dedicated the rest of his life to sabotaging the organization's work. His cartographic seals hadn't just been designed to reinforce dimensional barriers. They had been specifically engineered to disrupt the Order's summoning apparatus and prevent otherworldly entities from establishing permanent footholds in our reality. The Watchers were his attempt to create a sustainable system for maintaining these disruptions long after his own death. But according to the Obsidian Circle's research, Whitmore's understanding of interdimensional dynamics had been incomplete. His seals had succeeded in containing the most dangerous entities and preventing large-scale incursions. But they had also trapped beneficial, otherworldly contacts that could have provided valuable knowledge and assistance to humanity. The modern Obsidian Circle claimed to be the legitimate successor to the original Order, but with updated goals that focused on controlled research rather than unrestricted experimentation. They argued that 3 centuries of technological and theoretical advancement had made it possible to safely manage interdimensional contact in ways that Whitmore's era couldn't have imagined. Their proposed alternative to the seal renewal process involved replacing Whitmore's defensive barriers with a more sophisticated containment system that would allow selective communication with otherworldly entities while preventing unwanted intrusions. Instead of cutting Salem off from contact entirely, they wanted to transform it into a carefully managed interface between worlds. The theoretical framework they presented was impressive, drawing on advances in quantum physics, consciousness research, and systems theory that hadn't existed during Whitmore's lifetime. Their mathematical models suggested that controlled contact could provide solutions to major human problems: energy production, space travel, medical research, even the extension of human lifespan beyond natural biological limits. But the documents also included accounts of what had happened during previous attempts at controlled contact with otherworldly entities. The results had been mixed at best, with several experiments ending in deaths, disappearances, or psychological trauma for the researchers involved. A 1923 attempt by German occultists had resulted in the complete destruction of their research facility and the disappearance of all 17 team members. A 1967 project conducted by American military contractors had been shut down after otherworldly entities began manifesting at locations hundreds of miles from the experimental site. A 1984 experiment in Scotland had been abandoned when researchers realized that the entities they were contacting were systematically infiltrating and replacing the local population with dimensional duplicates. The most recent case study was particularly disturbing. In 1987, a research team affiliated with the Obsidian Circle had attempted to establish controlled contact at a dimensional weak point in Oregon. The project had been supervised by a cartographer named Jonathan Pierce, who had been recruited specifically for his experience with Whitmore's binding techniques. Pierce had initially cooperated with the Obsidian Circle's agenda, using his knowledge of cartographic seals to modify the Oregon site's dimensional properties. But something had gone wrong during the final phase of the experiment. Pierce had apparently abandoned the project and fled to Salem, where he had spent his final weeks desperately attempting to renew Whitmore's original seal network. His body had been found in his Salem apartment 3 days after the final seal. Locations had been renewed, with no obvious cause of death, but with evidence of extreme psychological stress. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that his body showed signs of rapid aging that suggested he had experienced decades of physical deterioration in a matter of days. The implication was clear: Pierce had discovered something about the Obsidian Circle's true agenda that had terrified him, enough to risk his life attempting to restore Whitmore's protective barriers. His fate served as both warning and precedent for anyone who might consider cooperating with the organization's current proposals. As I read through the final documents in the collection, I began to understand why the Obsidian Circle was so interested in recruiting me. They needed someone with knowledge of Whitmore's techniques to modify the existing SEAL network. But their previous attempts at cooperation had ended in betrayal and failure. They were hoping that a more gradual approach, presenting themselves as reasonable alternatives to the Watchers' demands, might succeed where more direct coercion had failed. But the historical records suggested that their agenda hadn't changed significantly since the colonial period. They still wanted to use Salem's dimensional instability for experimental purposes, and they were still willing to risk catastrophic consequences in pursuit of otherworldly knowledge and power. The question was whether I could find a third option that didn't involve choosing between the Watcher's eternal servitude and the Obsidian Circle's dangerous experimentation. I spent the rest of the night studying Whitmore's map more carefully, looking for details I might have missed during my initial examination. As I worked, I began to notice subtle features that hadn't been visible before: additional symbols, notations in different ink, and what appeared to be a secondary layer of information that only became apparent under specific lighting conditions. When I held the map at a certain angle under my desk lamp, previously invisible text appeared in the margins. These hidden annotations told a different story than either the Watchers or the Obsidian Circle had shared with me. According to Whitmore's secret notes, he had indeed discovered the true nature of Salem's supernatural activity, but his response had been more complex than simply creating defensive barriers. He had developed what he called the third path, a method for managing dimensional instability that didn't require either complete isolation or unrestricted contact. The third path involved creating selective barriers that could be temporarily modified to allow communication with specific types of otherworldly entities while maintaining protection against more dangerous forms of interdimensional intrusion. Instead of choosing between absolute defense and risky experimentation, Whitmore had tried to find a middle ground that balanced safety with the potential benefits of controlled contact. But implementing the third path required a level of knowledge and skill that went far beyond basic cartographic binding. It demanded understanding of otherworldly psychology, expertise in dimensional physics, and the ability to maintain precise control over extremely volatile supernatural forces. Whitmore's hidden notes suggested that he had been training a select group of individuals in these advanced techniques, preparing them to implement the third path after his death. But something had gone wrong, possibly the same something that had led to his mysterious disappearance in 1692. The last hidden entry in the map's secret annotations was dated just days before Whitmore vanished. The Order suspects my true intentions. They believe I am simply creating barriers to interfere with their work, not realizing that I am preparing a more sophisticated solution. But time grows short, and I fear I will not be able to complete the training of my successors. If something happens to me, the knowledge of the third path may be lost forever, leaving future generations to choose between two equally flawed alternatives. May God grant that someone with the wisdom to understand and the courage to act will someday recover what I have hidden here. I stared at the hidden text for a long time, considering its implications. If Whitmore had indeed developed a third alternative, and if that knowledge was somehow contained within the map itself, then I might not have to choose between becoming a Watcher or cooperating with the Obsidian Circle. But accessing that knowledge would require taking risks that might be even greater than either of the alternatives I was trying to avoid. Chapter 5. The Third Pather, next morning, brought news that changed everything. I woke to find a message slipped under my door knot, an elegant invitation like the one from the Obsidian Circle, but a hastily scrawled note on ordinary paper. Mr. Ashford Margaret Blackthorne found dead in her home this morning. Police say. Natural causes, but locals know better. You're in danger. The barriers are failing faster than expected. Meet me at the old burying point at noon if you want answers. A friend I called the Salem Police Department and confirmed that Margaret had indeed been found dead early that morning. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the officer I spoke with mentioned unusual circumstances that were being investigated. No signs of violence or forced entry, he explained, but the house was freezing cold despite the heating system running at maximum, and several witnesses reported seeing strange lights coming from the windows during the night. Could be electrical problems, but the utility company says all the systems were functioning normally. I remembered Margaret's warning about people who had died under mysterious circumstances after researching Salem's supernatural history. It seemed that her own family connection to Whitmore's work hadn't protected her from whatever forces were moving against people who possessed dangerous knowledge. By 11 a.m., I was walking through downtown Salem toward the old burying point, carrying Whitmore's map and a selection of equipment I thought might be useful for whatever I was about to encounter. The weather had turned cold and overcast, with a sharp wind that carried the smell of autumn leaves and something else, something like ozone or electrical discharge. The cemetery was nearly empty when I arrived, with just a few tourists wandering among the weathered headstones and reading the historical plaques. I found a bench near the back of the cemetery and waited, studying the map and trying to identify which of the surrounding graves might correspond to the seal location marked in this area. At exactly noon, a woman approached my bench. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that didn't match her apparent age. Mr. Ashford, I'm Sarah Chen. Margaret was my grattant. I stood to shake hands, noting that her grip was surprisingly strong and that her skin felt unusually warm despite the cold day. I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret was very helpful when I first arrived in Salem. She knew this day would come, Sarah replied, settling onto the bench beside me. Our family has been preparing for it for decades. Margaret wasn't just Ephraim's descendant, was also one of the Watchers. That information caught me completely off guard, but she seemed so present, so fully human. The Watchers aren't all completely incorporeal, Sarah explained. Some of them maintain partial physical existence, especially those who were recruited during their lifetimes rather than after death. Margaret volunteered to join them in 1963, after she discovered that the Obsidian Circle was planning something catastrophic. What kind of catastrophic? Sarah pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents. In the 1960s, the Circle attempted to establish contact with what they called the architect's entities, from a dimension where consciousness exists independently of physical matter. The idea was to learn their methods for transcending biological limitations and achieving what amounts to technological immortality. The photographs showed what appeared to be the aftermath of some kind of disaster. Buildings with walls that had been twisted into impossible geometric shapes, vehicles that had been fused with organic matter, and human figures that looked like they had been partially transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore. This was a small town in New Hampshire where the Circle conducted their experiment, Sarah continued. Population of about 300 people, the researchers thought. They could limit the contact to a single volunteer subject, but the architects had different ideas. They began systematically converting every human in the area into what they called improved forms. What happened to them? Margaret and several other watchers intervened. They managed to contain the intrusion and prevent it from spreading beyond the town limits, but they couldn't reverse what had already happened. The entire area had to be evacuated and declared a federal environmental disaster zone. Sarah showed me additional photograph aerial shots of a landscape that looked like it had been painted by a surrealist artist. Trees that grew in spirals and bore fruit that resembled human organs. Roads that formed complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, appearing solid from some angles and translucent from others. The town is still there, Sarah said quietly. Still inhabited by the converted residents, still growing more alien with each passing year. The federal government maintains a monitoring station at a safe distance, but they have no idea how to fix what happened or prevent it from eventually spreading. And the Obsidian Circle, they consider it a partial success. The experiment provided valuable data about architect psychology and methodology, and they believe they can avoid similar problems in future contact attempts. I thought about my meeting with Dr. Blackwood and his colleagues, remembering their confidence and apparent sophistication. It was disturbing to realize that people with such resources and education could be so cavalier about risks that might affect thousands of innocent lives. Is that what they're planning for Salem? Something similar, but on a much larger scale. Salem's dimensional infrastructure is more sophisticated than what they had access to in New Hampshire. They believe they can establish controlled contact with multiple types of otherworldly entities simultaneously, creating what they call a permanent interdimensional research facility. Sarah pulled out a modern map of Salem, marked with symbols and notations that looked similar to work but more complex. They've spent decades preparing for this. Secret facilities built under existing buildings, modified seal locations that can be converted from defensive barriers to summoning apparatus, and recruitment of local residents who can serve as volunteers. Subjects for contact experiments. The scope of their operation was staggering. According to Sarah's research, the Obsidian Circle had been systematically infiltrating Salem's government, business, community, and cultural organizations for over 50 years. Many of the town's most prominent citizens were either members of the organization or under its influence in some way. That's why Margaret volunteered to become a watcher, Sarah continued. She realized that the traditional approach for external cartographers to renew the seals wasn't going to be enough to counter such a comprehensive infiltration effort. The watchers needed inside information and ongoing surveillance to have any chance of preventing the Circle's plans. But she's dead now, which means the Circle is moving to eliminate anyone who might interfere with their final preparations. You're probably next on their list. I looked around the cemetery, suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable I was. The few tourists had departed, leaving me alone with Sarah in a location where help would be unlikely to arrive quickly if something went wrong. Why are you telling me this? How do I know you're not working for them? Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in the expression. Because I'm about to show you something that proves I'm on the same side as Ephraim and Margaret. She stood up and walked to a nearby headstone, one that bore the name Ephraim Whitmore and the date 1692. But as I watched, Sarah placed her hand on the stone and spoke a phrase in Latin that I recognized from the hidden annotations on Whitmore's map. The headstone began to glow with the same phosphorescence I'd observed in the map itself. The carved letters rearranged themselves, forming new words. Custos, tertii va, guardian of the third path, Serpentia, in umbrous wisdom in the shadows. Qui, Odette Vinchet, who dares wins Margaret, wasn't the only one who volunteered to join. The Watchers, Sarah said, her hands still glowing with the same energy that emanated from the headstone. Our family has been maintaining Ephraim's true legacy for over 3 centuries. Not just the defensive seals that most people know about, but the third path that he was developing before he disappeared. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying the knowledge wasn't lost. Not lost, just hidden. Ephraim knew that both the Order of the Obsidian Mirror and future generations of well-meaning but naive cartographers would try to use his work for their own purposes. So he created a secret lineage of guardians who would preserve the complete knowledge until someone worthy appeared to implement it. Sarah removed her hand from the headstone, and the glow faded, returning it to its original appearance. But I could still feel the residual energy in the air, a warmth that seemed to resonate with the map I carried. The third path isn't just a theoretical alternative, she continued. It's a complete system for managing interdimensional contact that Ephraim and his successors have been testing and refining for over 300 years. But implementing it requires someone with the right combination of skills, knowledge, and moral character to serve as the primary interface. Interface with what? With the entities from the other side who actually want to help humanity rather than exploit or transform us. Ephraim discovered that not all otherworldly beings are hostile or dangerous. Some of them are as concerned about the activities of malevolent entities as we are, and they're willing to work with humans to maintain stability between dimensions. Sarah led me deeper into the cemetery, toward a section where the headstones were older and more weathered. As we walked, she explained the true nature of Ephraim's discoveries. The dimensional weak points in Salem weren't created by the witch trials, she said. They're natural phenomena that have existed for thousands of years. The Abenaki knew about them and developed protocols for managing them safely. But the European colonists disrupted those traditional safeguards and began experimenting without understanding the consequences. And Ephraim figured out how to restore the balance. More than that, he learned to communicate directly with the entities the Abenaki called the Wise Ones, beings from a dimension where consciousness exists in harmony with natural forces rather than in opposition to them. They taught him methods for reinforcing dimensional barriers while maintaining selective access for beneficial contact. We stopped in front of a weathered stone monument that looked much older than the colonial-era graves surrounding it. The carving was so worn that I couldn't make out individual symbols, but the overall shape was familiar. It matched the complex seal designs I'd seen in Whitmore's hidden annotations. This is the original anchor point for the Third Path network, Sarah explained, built by the Abenaki centuries before European contact, modified by Ephraim in the 1680s, and maintained by our family ever since. She placed both hands on the ancient stone and began speaking in a language I didn't recognize, not Latin or English, but something that sounded more organic, like the wind through trees or water flowing over stones. The monument began to respond, not with the cold phosphorescence I'd seen elsewhere, but with a warm golden light that seemed to come from deep within the stone itself. The worn carvings became visible again, revealing symbols that were both alien and strangely familiar. The Wise Ones are still active, Sarah said without breaking her connection to the monument. They've been watching the situation in Salem with growing concern, waiting for the right opportunity to intervene. But they can't act directly in our dimension without a human partner who can serve as a bridge between worlds. And you think I'm that partner? The map chose you, David. Not just any map, Prifram's original document, imbued with his consciousness and programmed to seek out individuals with the specific qualities needed to implement the third path. The golden light from the monument was growing brighter, and I could feel it resonating with the map in my backpack. When I pulled out Whitmore's document, it was glowing with the same warm radiance, and I could see that new text was appearing in the previously blank areas. But this text wasn't in Latin or English. It was in the same organic language Sarah had been speaking, and somehow I could understand it without conscious translation. The time of choosing has come. The barriers weaken while those who would exploit them grow stronger. Will you accept the burden of the Bridgewalker and help us maintain the balance between worlds? I looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the weight of centuries of knowledge and responsibility. What exactly would I have to do? Complete the third path network by visiting each of the 13 seal locations and establishing direct communication with the wise ones. Learn their methods for selective dimensional management, and when the Obsidian Circle makes their final move, work with us to counter their plans without destroying Salem in the process. What about the Watchers? The traditional renewal process. They'll resist at first, Sarah admitted. Most of them don't know about the third path, that knowledge has been restricted to a very few guardians like Margaret and myself. But once they understand that we're offering them a chance to fulfill their original mission more effectively, they'll support the transition. The golden light was beginning to fade, and I could sense that the communication window with the wise ones was closing. But before the connection ended completely, I felt a presence touch my consciousness, sentient, patient, and infinitely wise. Images flashed through my mind. Salem as it had been before European contact with dimensional gateways that allowed beneficial exchange between worlds. The corruption that had followed when malevolent entities were given access through the Order's experiments. The careful work of repair and restoration that Ephraim had begun, and the potential future that could emerge if the third path was successfully implemented. I saw Salem transformed into something like what the Abenaki had originally meant, in the place where humans could safely interact with otherworldly allies while remaining protected from dangerous entities. A research center, but one dedicated to mutual understanding rather than exploitation. A bridge between dimensions that strengthened both sides rather than weakening them. But I also saw what would happen if I failed. The Obsidian Circle's plans coming to fruition, turning Salem into a dimensional doorway that malevolent entities could use to establish footholds throughout our world. The gradual corruption and transformation of human civilization as otherworldly influences spread beyond anyone's ability to control. The vision ended as the golden light faded completely, leaving me standing in an ordinary cemetery with a choice that would determine the fate of both Salem and the wider world. How long do I have to decide? I asked. The Obsidian Circle is planning their major operation for tomorrow night, Sarah replied. The new moon provides optimal conditions for the type of summoning they want to attempt. If we're going to implement the third path, we need to begin immediately. And if something goes wrong, watch part 2 for the rest of the story, and don't forget to like and subscribe, bitch.